You are a priest in the year 1396, standing in the cold stone halls of Westminster Abbey. Your breath mists in the autumn air as you clutch your prayer book, watching in fascination as servants scurry about, preparing for what the courtiers whisper will be the most unusual royal wedding England has ever witnessed. The bride has arrived from France, a princess, they say, daughter of King Charles himself. You've blessed many marriages in your time, joined countless hands in holy matrimony, but never have you seen such a stir at court. When the great oak doors swing open and the wedding party enters, your eyes widen in disbelief. The groom, King Richard Roman II, cuts an impressive figure at 29, tall, regal, his golden hair catching the filtered light streaming through the stained glass windows. Beside him walks what appears to be a child, barely reaching his elbow, her tiny hand swallowed entirely by his gloved palm. She cannot be more than 6 or 7 years old, this little princess in her elaborate French gown, her dark hair braided with pearls that seem too heavy for her small head. You steady yourself against the altar rail. This is Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England. In your lifetime, you've seen brides as young as 12 or 13. Political matches were the way of noble families. After all, you understand the times you live in. Life is brief and uncertain. The Great Plague swept through just 50 years ago, taking half the population. Kings must secure alliances while they can, and marriages seal treaties more permanently than any scroll or seal. As the ceremony begins, you watch the child's face. She seems more curious than frightened. Her large, dark eyes taking in the grandeur around her, the soaring Gothic arches, the flickering candles, the nobles in their finest silks and velvets. When King Richard speaks his vows, his voice is gentle, almost protective. This is no monster taking a child bride for base desires. This is a king fulfilling his duty to his realm, securing peace with France through this most sacred bond. The marriage will not be consummated. Everyone understands this. The little queen will be raised and educated at the English court until she comes of age. It is the way things are done. You bless their union with a steady voice, though your heart beats strangely as you pronounce them husband and wife. Watching this tiny girl become Queen of England, you cannot help but wonder what fate awaits her in the dangerous game of royal politics. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible of you that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard Roman II was never meant to be a love story. It was a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy, a human chess piece moved across the board to end one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, the H-100 Red Years' War. To understand Isabella's fate, we must first understand the world into which she was born and the forces that would shape her brief, tragic life. Isabella was born on November 9, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris, the eldest daughter of one of medieval Europe's most troubled monarchs. Her father, King Charles VI of France, suffered from bouts of madness which may have made for some frightful moments for the young princess. Known to history as Charles the Mad, her father's condition would periodically transform him from a capable ruler into a raving lunatic who sometimes forgot his own identity, believed he was made of glass, or refused to bathe for months at a time. Imagine little Isabella's childhood in the opulent but unstable French court. One day her father might bounce her on his knee, showering her with gifts and attention. The next she might find him cowering in a corner, screaming that assassins were coming to kill him, or standing motionless for hours, convinced that if he moved, his glass body would shatter into 1,000 pieces. The palace servants would hustle the children away during these episodes, but the fear and confusion lingered in young Isabella's eyes. Her mother, Isabel of Bavaria, was a formidable woman trying to hold the kingdom together during her husband's periods of incapacity. Beautiful and intelligent, Isabel had her own political ambitions and understood better than most that her children were valuable assets in the complex web of European politics. She watched her eldest daughter with calculating eyes, knowing that Isabel's beauty and royal blood would one day secure a crucial alliance for France. The world Isabella was born into was one of almost constant warfare. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been locked in a brutal conflict that had devastated both kingdoms. The H-100 Red Years' War had begun over English claims to the French throne, but it had evolved into something far more complex. A struggle for national identity, economic dominance, and territorial control that had consumed entire generations. French villages lay in ruins from English raids. English nobles had spent their fortunes financing campaigns across the Channel. Both kingdoms were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their people weary of war. By the 1390s, there were whispers in both courts of peace, but peace required more than just words. It required bonds that could not easily be broken. This is where 6-year-old Isabella entered the grand theatre of European politics. The idea of marrying Isabella to Richard Roman II first emerged during secret negotiations between French and English ambassadors in 1395. Richard had been devastated by the death of his beloved first wife Anne of Bohemia the previous year. Anne had been known as Good Queen Anne, adored by the English people for her gentleness and charity. Her death from plague had left Richard not only grief-stricken, but also without an heir, a dangerous situation for any medieval monarch. Richard's advisors urged him to remarry quickly, but the English king was initially resistant. His marriage to Anne had been one of genuine affection, rare among royal unions. The thought of replacing her felt like a betrayal of her memory, but duty to the realm ultimately outweighed personal sentiment. And when French ambassadors arrived with a proposal that could end the war, Richard began to listen. The French proposition was audacious in its scope. They offered not just the hand of the king's eldest daughter, but a dowry of 800,000 francs, an astronomical sum that would go far toward refilling England's war-depleted treasury. More importantly, they offered a 28-year truce, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without knowing war. There was one significant obstacle. Isabella was only 6 years old, even by medieval standards. This was unusually young for a royal bride. Most political marriages involved girls who were at least approaching adolescence. But the French negotiators argued that this very youth was an advantage. The marriage would symbolize a new beginning, unsullied by the hatred and blood that had characterized relations between the two kingdoms. Isabella would be raised at the English court, learning English customs and loyalties. By the time she was old enough to rule as queen consort, she would be as much English as French. Richard's counselors were divided. Some saw the wisdom in the proposal. The dowry alone would fund the royal household for years, and the extended truce would allow England to focus on other threats, particularly the growing power of Scotland and ongoing rebellions in Ireland. Others worried about the precedent of marrying a child so young, fearing it would scandalize even the medieval nobility. But Richard himself was intrigued by something else entirely. Court observers noted that when he saw the miniature portrait of Isabella sent by the French ambassadors, something in his expression softened. Here was a child who would need protection, guidance, and care. Perhaps some whispered The childless king saw in this arrangement not just a political alliance, but the opportunity to be a father as well as a husband. The negotiation stretched on for months, with ambassadors crossing the Channel repeatedly to hammer out the intricate detail. Every aspect of Isabella's future life was debated and codified. She would retain her French servants and ladies in waiting. She would be allowed to practice French customs and maintain correspondence with her family. Most crucially, all parties agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity, a protection that was written explicitly into the treaty. Meanwhile, in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella played with her dolls, unaware that her fate was being decided in council chambers and written into documents sealed with wax and ribbon. Her tutors began teaching her English phrases, and seamstresses started work on a trousseau fit for a queen. She was told she was going to marry a great king across the water, but at 6, the concept was no more real to her than the fairy tales her nurses told at bedtime. The wedding ceremony took place not once, but twice, reflecting the diplomatic complexity of the union. Isabella was only 7 when she wed Richard Roman II at the English-controlled port of Colla on October 31st, 1396. This first ceremony was intimate, attended primarily by negotiators and high-ranking nobles from both kingdoms. Colla, as English territory on French soil, provided neutral ground for this historic moment. Standing in the great hall of Colla Castle, Isabella must have been overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. She wore a gown of cloth of gold, so heavy with embroidery and pearls that she needed help walking. Her new husband knelt to her level to exchange rings, and witnesses noted how gently he lifted her chin when she seemed frightened by the assembled nobles staring at her. A year later, she was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey. Allegedly, several people died in the crush to get a glimpse of the famous young bride. The English people had heard tales of their new child queen, and curiosity drew massive crowds to London for the coronation. The ceremony itself was a spectacular display of royal pageantry, designed to show both the English nobility and foreign observers that this unusual marriage had the full support of the crown. Isabella processed through London streets in a litter decorated with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, symbolizing the union of the two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially made for her small head, and her train was carried by English duchesses, who had been chosen to serve as her guardians and teachers. The crowds that lined the streets called out blessings in English, which she was only beginning to understand, but she smiled and waved as she had been taught. The coronation feast that followed lasted 3 days, with entertainment that included jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical presentations depicting the glorious future that this marriage would bring to both kingdoms. Isabella sat at the high table beside Richard, picking at her food with the careful manners her French tutors had drilled into her, while nobles toasted the health of the child queen. But even as the celebrations continued, experienced courtiers were already beginning to wonder how long this peace would last. Medieval trusses, no matter how elaborately negotiated, were fragile things. Richard Roman II, despite his current power, was not universally loved by his nobles. There were whispers of discontent, particularly among those who felt the king was too influenced by his favorites and too willing to make peace with France when England's military position remained strong. For the moment, however, Isabella was safe in her new home. Richard installed her in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, staffed with a carefully chosen household that blended French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons, not just in languages and courtly accomplishments, but in the complex etiquette of English court life. She learned to curtsy in the English fashion, to prefer wine over ale at meals, and to speak English with the accent of the court rather than her French tutors. Richard himself took an active interest in her education and welfare. Contemporary chronicles describe him visiting her apartments regularly, bringing her gifts from across his realm, exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's best artisan. He seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, and she began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with the mixture of formality and affection that marked their unusual relationship. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own. Medieval royal households typically included numerous young nobles being raised and educated alongside the monarch's own family. Isabella found particular friendship with the daughters of Richard's supporters, girls close to her own age who helped her navigate the subtle hierarchies and unspoken rules of English noble society. Her favorite companion was Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was only 2 years older than Isabella, but seemed worldly and sophisticated to the young queen. It was Margaret who taught Isabella English children's games, who helped her understand which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with secrets, and who warned her about the political undercurrents that even children couldn't entirely escape. The two girls would spend hours in Isabella's private garden, practicing their needlework, while Margaret explained the genealogies of English noble houses and the ancient feuds that still simmered beneath the surface of court politeness. Isabella was a quick learner, and her French perspective on English politics often provided insights that surprised her older companions. Why, Isabella once asked Margaret, do the English nobles seem to watch each other so carefully? In France there are factions and quarrels, but here everyone seems to be waiting for something to happen. Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained that Richard's reign had been marked by conflicts with his nobles almost from the beginning. There had been a major rebellion when he was young, and he had never entirely forgiven those who had opposed him. Meanwhile, many of the great lords believed Richard was too fond of his court favorites and too willing to ignore their advice on matters of war and governance. "The king is powerful now," Margaret said, "but power in England must be shared with the nobles. Your marriage helps him because it brings peace with France, but some think it shows he is weak, that he prefers negotiation to conquest." Isabella absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a child who was beginning to understand that her life was connected to forces much larger than herself. She began to watch the interactions at court with new eyes, noticing how certain nobles would fall silent when Richard entered a room, how conversations would shift when she appeared, how even her French ladies-in-waiting seemed to choose their words carefully when discussing political matters. The years 1397 and 1398 passed peacefully for Isabella. She grew from a tiny child into a more confident girl, her English becoming fluent, her understanding of court life more sophisticated. Richard continued to treat her with paternal kindness, and she began to feel genuinely at home in England. The massive stone walls of Westminster became familiar rather than intimidating, and she could navigate the complex maze of corridors and chambers without getting lost. Her education expanded beyond the typical feminine accomplishments of needlework and music. Richard insisted that she learn to read and write in both French and English, and her tutors included some of the finest scholars in the kingdom. She studied history, particularly the chronicles of English and French kings, learning about the great figures whose actions had shaped the world she now inhabited. One of her favorite lessons involved maps. Her tutor, a learned clerk named Master William, would spread great parchments across the floor of her study chamber, showing her the extent of both kingdoms and explaining how geography had influenced centuries of conflict. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, tracing the coastlines with her finger, imagining the ships that carried armies and ambassadors back and forth across the channel. "See here, Your Grace," Master William would say, pointing to the narrow waters between Dover and Culla. "This small strip of water has been both a bridge and a barrier between our peoples. Your marriage represents the hope that it might finally serve only as a bridge." Isabella nodded solemnly, understanding, even at 8 years old, that she embodied something larger than herself. She was not just a girl learning to be a queen. She was a living symbol of peace between two nations that had been enemies for longer than anyone could remember. But symbols, as Isabella was about to learn, could be fragile things in the violent world of medieval politics. The first signs of trouble came in early 1399, when Isabella noticed changes in the atmosphere at court. Conversation stopped more abruptly when she appeared. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Even Margaret Holland seemed distracted and anxious, though she tried to maintain their usual routines. Richard himself seemed different. His visits to Isabella's apartments became less frequent, and when he did come, he appeared preoccupied, sometimes staring out the windows toward the Thames, as if expecting to see ships on the horizon. His usual gifts of books and trinkets ceased, and Isabella began to wonder if she had somehow displeased him. The truth was far more serious than a child's transgression. Richard was facing the greatest crisis of his reign, and it had nothing to do with his young queen. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled the previous year, had returned to England with an army, claiming that he had come only to reclaim his inheritance, but clearly intending much more. The English nobles, many of whom had long chafed under Richard's rule, began to flock to Henry's banner. The carefully constructed stability that had allowed Isabella to feel safe at the English court was crumbling with terrifying speed. Isabella first realized the severity of the situation when she woke one morning to find that several of her English ladies-in-waiting had disappeared during the night. When she asked her French attendants where they had gone, she received only evasive answers. By afternoon she could hear shouting from the courtyard below her windows, and when she looked out, she saw armed men wearing unfamiliar livery. Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chambers that evening, her face pale with fear. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently. "Only the most essential things. We're leaving Westminster tonight." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her heart beginning to race with the kind of panic she hadn't felt since her first days in England. "To the Tower," Margaret replied. "The king says it's for your safety," but she didn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. The Tower of London was both palace and prison, and in times of political upheaval, the distinction often became meaningless. The journey through London's dark streets was unlike anything in Isabella's previous experience. Instead of the ceremonial processions she was accustomed to, they traveled in a small, heavily guarded convoy, with armed men riding before and behind her litter. The curtains were drawn, but she could hear the sounds of the city around them, not the usual noise of commerce and daily life, but something more urgent and threatening. At the Tower, Isabella was installed in apartments that were comfortable but clearly designed to contain rather than simply house their occupant. The windows were barred and guards stood at every entrance. Her French ladies-in-waiting were allowed to remain with her, but most of her English attendants were dismissed. For the first time since arriving in England, Isabella felt truly isolated. Richard came to see her on her second day at the Tower, and the change in him was shocking. The confident, kindly king she had known was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in a matter of weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a wildness that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of her father's episodes of madness. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair as he had done during their first meeting, "I'm afraid our circumstances have become difficult. There are those who question my right to rule, who seek to overturn the peace we have built with your father's kingdom." Isabella, now 9 years old and far more sophisticated than she had been 3 years earlier, understood the implications. "Are you still king?" she asked directly. Richard's smile was bitter for now, but Henry Bowling broke as many supporters, and I may not be able to protect you as I once could. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had. For the first time, Richard spoke to Isabella, not as a child to be sheltered, but as a political equal, who needed to understand the realities of her situation. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that many of the great nobles had abandoned Richard's cause, and that the future of both England and the peace with France now hung in the balance. "What will happen to me?" Isabella asked, displaying a composure that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a 9-year-old girl. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and Isabella could see that this uncertainty tormented him. "Henry may seek to use you as a bargaining chip with your father, or he may honor our marriage and continue to protect you. Much depends on whether he values peace with France above his own ambitions." This was Isabella's first real lesson in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics. Her value as a person was secondary to her value as a symbol and a diplomatic asset. The love and care Richard had shown her, genuine though it may have been, could not shield her from the larger forces that were reshaping the English kingdom. The next few weeks passed in agonizing uncertainty. Isabella could hear the sounds of the city beyond the tower walls, but she was cut off from reliable news about what was happening. Her French ladies whispered among themselves in their native tongue, but even they seemed to know little beyond rumors and speculation. Finally, on a grey October morning, Isabella heard the sound she had been dreading, the heavy footsteps of armed men approaching her chambers. When the doors opened, she saw not the guards she had become accustomed to, but new men wearing the red rose livery of Henry Bolingbroke. The man who entered behind them was tall and imposing, with the bearing of a soldier and the calculating eyes of a politician. This was Henry himself, now Henry IVTH of England, come to meet the child who represented both an opportunity and a problem for his new reign. Isabella rose from her chair and curtsied deeply, as she had been taught to do when meeting a king. Henry studied her for a long moment, taking in her poise, her obvious intelligence, and perhaps calculating what use he might make of her. "Your Grace," he said formally, and Isabella noted that he still used her royal title, "I regret that circumstances have made it necessary to discuss your future under such conditions. What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, referring to Richard with the directness that had become her hallmark. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. "He has abdicated in favor of my claim to the throne." Isabella knew enough about politics to understand that abdicated likely meant was forced to give up the crown, but she didn't challenge the euphemism. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most to her immediate future. "What becomes of me?" Henry's answer would determine whether Isabella remained a queen or became merely a very valuable prisoner. Her fate hung on the new king's assessment of how best to use the peace treaty with France, whether to maintain it or to risk war for the sake of other political objectives. That, Henry said, depends on many factors. Your father's response to recent events, the advice of my counselors, and perhaps most importantly, your own conduct in the coming months. With those words, 9-year old Isabella began the most dangerous period of her young life. The protective bubble of Richard's court was gone, replaced by the harsh realities of a kingdom in transition. She was no longer just a child queen being raised to fulfill her royal duties. She was a political prisoner whose value might be measured against the cost of war or peace. The weeks that followed Richard's deposition were a masterclass in survival for Isabella. Confined to the Tower, but not yet formally imprisoned, she had to navigate the treacherous waters of a court that was still deciding what to do with her. Some of Henry's supporters argued that she should be sent back to France immediately, both to avoid the expense of maintaining her household and to signal that England was ready to renegotiate the peace treaty from a position of strength. Others counseled caution, pointing out that Isabella's presence gave England leverage in any future negotiations with France. As long as she remained in English custody, her father would be reluctant to take any action that might endanger her welfare. This faction argued that she should be maintained in comfort, but kept under careful watch. Isabella herself played her part with remarkable skill for such a young girl. She was unfailingly polite to her new captives, careful never to give offense or appear to be plotting against Henry's government. At the same time, she maintained the dignity befitting her rank, refusing to be treated as anything less than the queen she legally remained. Her French ladies-in-waiting proved invaluable during this period. Unlike her English attendants who had been dismissed or had fled, these women remained loyal to Isabella's interests rather than to any English faction. They helped her understand the nuances of her situation and coached her in the careful balance she needed to maintain. Remember her chief lady-in-waiting, Madame Ducy, advised her, "You are still Queen of England in the eyes of the law and of your father's court. Henry may wear the crown, but he has not yet dared to dissolve your marriage or formally repudiate the treaty. As long as that remains true, you have value, and where there is value, there is hope." This hope, however, came with a terrible cost that Isabella was only beginning to understand. Word began to filter into the Tower about Richard's fate. First came rumors that he had died in captivity at Pontefract Castle. Then came whispers that his death had not been natural, that Henry's supporters had arranged for the former king to meet with an accident. When Isabella finally received confirmation that Richard was dead, the news hit her with unexpected force. She had never loved Richard as a wife loves a husband. How could she, when she was still a child? But he had been kind to her, had protected her, had been the closest thing to a father figure she had known since leaving France. His death represented not just personal loss, but the severing of her last connection to the life she had built in England. The manner of Richard's death also carried ominous implications for her own future. If Henry was willing to arrange the murder of an anointed king, what scruples would he have about disposing of a French princess who had outlived her usefulness? These fears proved well-founded when, in early 1400, Isabella received an ultimatum from Henry's government. She would be allowed to return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as the rightful King of England, and renounced any claims she might have to the English throne as Richard's widow. The proposed agreement was a diplomatic masterpiece from Henry's perspective. By voluntarily leaving England, Isabella would implicitly accept that her marriage to Richard had been dissolved by his deposition. This would free Henry from the obligations of the original peace treaty, while avoiding the political complications of forcibly expelling a child queen. For Isabella, the choice was stark. Accept exile and acknowledge that her 3 years as Queen of England had been meaningless, or refuse and risk remaining a prisoner indefinitely. At 10 years old, she was being asked to make a decision that would affect not only her own future, but the relationship between England and France for years to come. Her French advisers were divided. Some argued that she should accept the terms and return to the safety of her father's court, where she could be cared for properly and perhaps eventually find a new marriage. Others insisted that she should refuse, maintaining that she remained Richard's legitimate widow and England's rightful queen regardless of Henry's usurpation. Isabella herself struggled with the decision for weeks. Part of her longed to return to France to see her family again and escape the uncertain atmosphere of Henry's court. But another part of her recognized that accepting Henry's terms would be a betrayal of Richard's memory and an abandonment of the peace he had died trying to preserve. In the end, the decision was made for her by events beyond her control. Charles VI, during one of his lucid periods, sent word that he expected his daughter to return to France immediately. The message delivered through diplomatic channels made it clear that continued negotiations over Isabella's status would be interpreted as an act of hostility by the French crown. Faced with the prospect of renewed war with France, Henry's government quickly agreed to Isabella's departure. The terms of her release were kept deliberately vague, allowing both sides to interpret her return as either voluntary or forced, depending on their political needs. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was a bittersweet experience for Isabella. She was leaving behind the only home she had known for 5 years, abandoning the apartments where she had learned to read English poetry, the gardens where she had played with Margaret Holland, the great hall where she had been crowned Queen of England. At the same time, she was returning to a family and a country that had become foreign to her during her years in England. She now spoke French with a slight English accent, preferred English fashions to French ones, and had to relearn the etiquette of her father's court. The little girl, who had left Paris at 6, was returning as a young woman of 11, shaped by experiences that none of her French relatives could fully understand. The reunion with her parents was complicated by her father's deteriorating mental condition. Charles VI was in the midst of one of his worst episodes when Isabella arrived, convinced that he was being pursued by invisible enemies and refusing to recognize his own family. When he finally emerged from his madness several weeks later, he seemed confused by Isabella's presence, as if he had forgotten that she had been married to the English king. Her mother, Isabel, was more welcoming, but also more calculating. The Queen of France immediately began considering how Isabella's unique position might be used to advance French interests. As the widow of an English king, Isabella had a certain diplomatic status that could prove valuable in future negotiations. More immediately, her experience at the English court made her a valuable source of intelligence about English politics and military capabilities. Isabella found herself caught between these competing demands on her loyalty and knowledge. She was French by birth and had returned to French soil, but she had also been Queen of England and felt some lingering obligation to the country that had been her home. When her mother's advisers questioned her about English defenses or Henry's support among the nobility, she answered carefully, providing general information while avoiding details that might be used to plan military campaigns. The months following her return to France were a period of adjustment and reflection for Isabella. She was no longer a child, but she was not yet fully adult. At 11, she had already experienced more political upheaval and personal loss than most people encountered in a lifetime. The question now was what role she would play in the complex world of medieval European politics. Her status as a former Queen of England made her an attractive marriage prospect for various European nobles, but it also complicated any potential matches. Some potential suitors were intimidated by her royal rank and political significance. Others were more interested in the political advantages of marrying her than in Isabella herself. Isabella, for her part, had developed strong opinions about marriage based on her experiences with Richard. She had seen how political marriages could provide protection and stability, but she had also witnessed how quickly such arrangements could collapse when circumstances changed. Any future husband would need to understand that she was not simply a diplomatic asset, but a young woman with her own intelligence, preferences, and ambitions. The French court of 1401 was a dangerous place for someone with Isabella's complex loyalties. The ongoing war with England meant that anti-English sentiment ran high among the nobility, and Isabella's years as Queen of England made some courtiers view her with suspicion. She had to be careful not to appear too sympathetic to English interests, while also not betraying the genuine affection she had felt for Richard and some of his supporters. At the same time, her father's mental instability meant that the French government was effectively controlled by competing factions of nobles, each seeking to advance their own interests. Isabella had to navigate these factional disputes while avoiding being used as a pawn by any particular group. Her mother Isabeau proved to be both protector and potential threat. The Queen of France genuinely cared for Isabella's welfare, but she was also a sophisticated political operator who saw her daughter's experiences and connections as valuable resources for the crown. Isabeau's protection came with expectations that Isabella would serve French interests, even when those interests conflicted with her own preferences or moral convictions. The year 1402 brought new complications when Isabella received word that Henry IVTH was facing serious rebellions in England. The Percy family, once his supporters, had turned against him, and there were uprisings in Wales and Scotland as well. Some at the French court argued that this was an opportunity to invade England and restore the rightful dynasty, possibly with Isabella playing a symbolic role as the legitimizing widow of the last Plantagenet king. Isabella found herself horrified by these discussions. She had no desire to see England torn apart by civil war. Regardless of her feelings about Henry's usurpation, the English people she had known, her servants, her tutors, her childhood companions, were innocent of the political crimes committed by their rulers. The idea of French armies ravaging English villages in her name was deeply disturbing to her. When directly asked for her opinion about potential military action against England, Isabella chose her words carefully. She pointed out that any invasion would likely result in massive casualties on both sides, that the English people might rally to defend their homeland regardless of their feelings about Henry, and that success was far from guaranteed given England's natural defenses and military traditions. Her reluctance to support anti-English action earned her some criticism from French hawks who accused her of divided loyalties, but Isabella's position was supported by more moderate voices at court who argued that peaceful relations with England served French interest better than renewed warfare. These political tensions came to a head in 1403 when Isabella was approached by representatives of Charles, Duke of Orleans, with a marriage proposal that would dramatically change her life once again. The Duke of Orleans was Isabella's cousin, the son of her father's brother, and one of the most powerful nobles in France. At 29, he was exactly the same age Richard had been when he married Isabella, but this time the age gap seemed less significant, given that Isabella was now approaching 14. The proposed marriage was attractive from several perspectives. It would keep Isabella within the French royal family, preventing her from becoming a diplomatic asset for some foreign power. It would also align her with one of the most cultured and sophisticated courts in Europe. As the Duke of Orleans was known as a patron of arts and literature, as well as a capable military commander. For Isabella personally, the match offered the prospect of a marriage based on mutual respect, rather than pure political calculation. She had met her cousin several times during her childhood, and he had always treated her with courtesy and kindness. More importantly, he was old enough and experienced enough to be a true partner rather than simply another guardian figure. The negotiations for this marriage took place against the backdrop of continuing chaos in England and growing French confidence that Henry IVTH's reign might not survive its early challenges. If Henry fell, there was always the possibility that Isabella might be recalled to England to legitimize a new regime. This potential complication made the timing of Isabella's remarriage crucial from a French perspective. Charles of Orleans understood the delicate nature of the situation. He was not merely seeking a wife, but potentially allying himself with a woman who might one day be called upon to play a role in English politics. This added a layer of complexity to their courtship that was unusual, even by the standards of medieval noble marriages. When Isabella first met with Charles to discuss the marriage seriously, she was struck by how different he was from Richard. Where Richard had been gentle and somewhat otherworldly, Charles was passionate and intensely engaged with the world around him. He spoke to her not as a child to be protected, but as an equal whose opinions and experiences mattered. "I want you to understand," he told her during one of their private conversations, "that I am not seeking to marry the former Queen of England. I am seeking to marry Isabella of Valois, the remarkable young woman who survived the courts of 2 kingdoms and emerged with her dignity intact." Isabella found herself genuinely attracted to Charles in a way she had never experienced before. At 14, she was no longer a child, and the feelings stirring within her were those of a young woman discovering her own desires and preferences. Charles was handsome, cultured, and intelligent, but more importantly, he seemed to see her as an individual rather than merely a political asset. The marriage negotiations proceeded swiftly once both parties had agreed to the basic terms. Isabella would bring to the marriage her status as a former queen and her valuable political connections, while Charles would provide her with a secure position in French society and protection from those who might seek to use her for their own purposes. The wedding took place in June 1406 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, a ceremony that deliberately contrasted with Isabella's first marriage, where her wedding to Richard had been a small diplomatic affair. This celebration was a grand spectacle designed to demonstrate the power and prosperity of the French royal house. Isabella, now 16, wore a gown of deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, her dark hair crowned with a circlet of sapphires and pearls. She walked down the aisle of the great cathedral with confidence, no longer the frightened child who had been married to a stranger, but a young woman choosing her own path. Charles waited for her at the altar in his finest robes, his face showing genuine happiness rather than mere diplomatic satisfaction. When they exchanged vows, their voices were clear and strong, and observers noted that they looked directly at each other rather than simply reciting words to satisfy political necessity. The wedding feast that followed was a celebration of French culture and power. Troubadours sang ballads in honor of the couple. Elaborate theatrical performances depicted the triumph of love over adversity, and the finest wines from across the realm flowed freely. Isabella found herself relaxing and enjoying the festivities in a way she had never been able to do during her time in England. More importantly, she felt for the first time since leaving France as a child that she truly belonged somewhere. The French court had accepted her back, not as a failed political experiment, but as a valuable member of the royal family who had gained wisdom and experience from her trials. The early years of Isabella's marriage to Charles were among the happiest of her life. Charles proved to be not only a devoted husband, but also an intellectual companion who shared her interests in literature, music, and the arts. His court at Blaye became a center of cultural refinement, attracting poets, scholars, and artists from across Europe. Isabella threw herself into a new role with enthusiasm. She patronized troubadours and commissioned illuminated manuscripts, established a scriptorum where monks copied and preserved important texts, and maintained correspondence with scholars throughout Europe. Her experiences in England had given her a unique perspective on European culture, and she used this knowledge to foster intellectual exchange between French and foreign courts. She also began to develop her own political voice. Charles valued her insights into English affairs, but more importantly, he respected her judgment on a wide range of issues affecting their Dutch and the kingdom as a whole. Isabella found herself becoming a true partner in governance, not merely a decorative consort. The couple's first child, a daughter named Yin, was born in 1407. Isabella approached motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else, determined to be a more present parent than her own mother had been able to be during the chaos of her father's reign. She insisted on nursing the baby herself, despite the protests of court physicians who considered this beneath the dignity of a duchess. Holding her daughter for the first time, Isabella felt a profound sense of completion. This child would grow up knowing her parents' love and protection, free from the political machinations that had shaped Isabella's own childhood. She whispered promises to the sleeping infant in both French and English, vowing that Jean would have choices that Isabella herself had never been given. The birth of their daughter strengthened the bond between Isabella and Charles. He proved to be a devoted father, spending time with Jean despite the demands of his political and military responsibilities. Isabella often found him in the nursery, reading to their daughter, or simply watching her sleep, marveling at the miracle of this new life they had created together. But even as Isabella enjoyed domestic happiness, the larger world continued to intrude. News from England remained troubling, with Henry Roman IV facing continued rebellions and challenges to his authority. More immediately threatening was the growing tension within France itself, as the king's mental illness created a power vacuum that various noble factions were eager to fill. Isabella's father-in-law, Louis of Orleans, was one of the most ambitious of these nobles. As the king's brother, he claimed the right to govern during Charles VI's periods of incapacity. But this claim was disputed by the Duke of Burgundy, who had his own supporters and his own vision for France's future. The rivalry between the Orleans and Burgundian factions would eventually tear France apart. But in the early years of Isabella's marriage, it seemed like just another of the political disputes that constantly swirled around the royal court. Isabella tried to stay above these factional conflicts, focusing on her family and her cultural pursuits while leaving the political maneuvering to others. This comfortable neutrality became impossible to maintain in November 1407, when Louis of Orleans was assassinated on the streets of Paris by agents of the Duke of Burgundy. The murder was carried out with shocking boldness, the killers striking down the king's brother in broad daylight before disappearing into the maze of Paris's medieval streets. The assassination transformed Isabella's life overnight. Charles, who had inherited his father's titles and responsibilities, was now one of the most powerful men in France, but he was also a mocked man. The Duke of Burgundy had demonstrated his willingness to use violence against his enemies, and the Orleans family was now his primary target. Isabella found herself thrust into a world of bodyguards and constant vigilance. Her movements were restricted for security reasons, and her correspondence was monitored to ensure that no information about her family's activities fell into enemy hands. The carefree atmosphere of their court at Blaye was replaced by the grim reality of civil war. Charles himself was transformed by his father's murder. The cultured, artistic young man, Isabella, had married began to show a harder edge, driven by a desire for vengeance that sometimes frightened her. He began to gather allies and resources for what everyone knew would be a long and bloody conflict with the Burgundian faction. Isabella supported her husband's cause, but worried about the cost of the coming war. She had already seen how political violence could destroy lives and kingdoms, and she feared that France would suffer the same fate that had befallen England during the Wars of the Roses. Her concerns proved prophetic as the conflict between the Orleans and Burgundian factions escalated into open warfare. The birth of Isabella's second child, a son named Charles in 1408, provided a brief respite from the political tensions. The arrival of a male heir strengthened the Orleans' claim to eventual leadership of France, but it also made Isabella's family an even more attractive target for their enemies. Isabella approached her son's upbringing with even greater care than she had shown with John. She was determined that Charles would grow up understanding both the privileges and responsibilities of his noble birth, but she also wanted him to develop the kind of character that would allow him to navigate the treacherous world of medieval politics without losing his humanity. She insisted on being involved in every aspect of his education, from the selection of tutors to the design of his curriculum. Drawing on her own experiences at the English court, she ensured that her son learned multiple languages, studied the histories of various European kingdoms, and developed the diplomatic skills that would be essential to his future role. The early years of the Civil War were marked by a series of battles and sieges that gradually exhausted both sides. Isabella found herself managing the family's territories while Charles was away campaigning, a responsibility that required her to master the complex logistics of medieval warfare and governance. She proved surprisingly adept at these tasks, using her diplomatic skills to maintain alliances and her organizational abilities to ensure that supplies and reinforcements reached Charles's forces when needed. Her letters from this period reveal a woman who had fully embraced her role as a political leader, no longer the confused child who had been shuffled between courts, but a mature woman taking control of her own destiny. The war took a devastating toll on France. Entire regions were laid waste by competing armies. Trade was disrupted, and the common people suffered from the depredations of soldiers from both sides. Isabella used her position to provide relief where she could, establishing charitable foundations and negotiating safe passage for refugees fleeing the worst of the fighting. Her efforts to help the victims of the war enhanced her reputation throughout France. She became known not just as the Duchess of Orleans, but as a compassionate leader who remembered her obligations to the common people. This reputation would prove valuable in the years to come as the political situation in France became even more complicated. The birth of Isabella's third child, a daughter named Margarita, in 1409, was both a joy and a source of anxiety. Isabella was now 20, and the repeated pregnancies were taking a toll on her health. Medieval medicine offered little understanding of maternal mortality, but Isabella was intelligent enough to recognize the risks she faced with each childbirth. She approached this pregnancy with particular care, following the advice of the best physicians available and preparing detailed instructions for the care of her children in case something happened to her. These preparations proved to be prescient as complications during Margaret's birth nearly cost Isabella her life. For several days after the delivery, Isabella hovered between life and death, her body weakened by blood loss and infection. Charles rarely left her bedside, and messengers were sent throughout Europe to pray for her recovery. The possibility that she might die forced both Isabella and Charles to confront the fragility of their happiness and the uncertain future facing their children. Isabella's recovery was slow and incomplete. The birth had damaged her health in ways that would affect her for the rest of her life, leaving her weakened and susceptible to the various illnesses that plagued medieval populations. More immediately, her physicians warned that another pregnancy would likely kill her, advice that profoundly affected her relationship with Charles. The couple's physical intimacy became cautious and constrained, overshadowed by the fear of conception. This change in their relationship was difficult for both of them, but particularly for Isabella, who had found great joy in the physical expression of their love. The passionate young woman who had discovered her own desires was now forced to suppress them for the sake of survival. Despite these challenges, Isabella and Charles's marriage remained strong. They found new ways to express their love and partnership, focusing on their shared interests in culture and politics. Isabella became even more involved in the governance of their territories, effectively serving as Charles's co-ruler while he campaigned against the Burgundians. The year 1410 brought new complications when the Duke of Burgundy began negotiating with the English, seeking to bring Henry Roman IV into the French Civil War on the Burgundian side. The prospect of English intervention horrified Isabella, who feared that France would suffer the same devastation that had characterized the 100 Years' War. Isabella used her unique position as a former Queen of England to open back channel communications with the English court. Through intermediaries, she attempted to persuade Henry Roman IV that intervention in the French Civil War would be costly and ultimately futile. Her efforts were hampered by the fact that many in England still viewed her with suspicion, but she persisted in trying to prevent the resumption of large-scale warfare between the two kingdoms. These diplomatic efforts revealed Isabella's growing sophistication as a political operator. She understood that her value lay not just in her royal connections, but in her ability to see the larger patterns of European politics and to craft strategies that served multiple interests simultaneously. The success of her diplomatic initiatives enhanced her reputation in France and abroad. She began to be consulted not just on matters affecting her husband's territories, but on broader questions of French policy. Her opinions carried weight because of her unique experiences and her demonstrated ability to navigate complex political situations. Isabella's health continued to deteriorate throughout 1411 and 1412. The damage from Margaret's birth had left her vulnerable to respiratory infections, and she suffered from chronic fatigue that made her daily activities increasingly difficult. She began to spend more time in contemplation and prayer, perhaps sensing that her time was limited. Despite her physical weaknesses, Isabella remained mentally sharp and emotionally engaged with her family and responsibilities. She continued to oversee her children's education, to manage the family's political affairs, and to pursue her cultural interests. Her determination to live fully despite her health problems was an inspiration to those around her. The spring of 1409 brought a brief period of hope when preliminary peace negotiations began between the Aulin and Burgundian factions. Isabella played a significant role in these discussions, using her diplomatic skills and her reputation for fairness to help bridge the gap between the two sides. The negotiations ultimately failed, but Isabella's efforts were widely praised and enhanced her standing as a potential mediator in future conflicts. Her ability to work with representatives from both factions demonstrated her political maturity and her commitment to finding peaceful solutions to France's problems. As 1409 progressed, Isabella's health began to fail more dramatically. The chronic respiratory problems that had plagued her since Margaret's birth worsened, and she began to suffer from the wasting disease that would eventually claim her life. Medieval physicians had no understanding of the tuberculosis that was likely killing her, but they could see that her condition was grave. Isabella faced the prospect of death with the same courage she had shown throughout her life. She made careful provisions for her children's future, ensuring that they would be protected and educated regardless of what happened to her. She also worked to secure the political position of her husband's faction, understanding that her death might create opportunities for their enemies. Her final months were spent in preparation for death and in cherishing the time she had left with her family. She insisted on continuing her daily activities as long as possible. Determined not to become a burden to those she loved, her bravery in the face of terminal illness became legendary, inspiring stories and songs that would be told for generations. Isabella of Valois died on September 13, 409, at the age of 20. She had lived a life that spanned 3 kingdoms and 2 marriages, experiencing both the heights of royal power and the depths of political uncertainty. Her death was mourned throughout Europe, not just by her family and subjects, but by the many people whose lives she had touched through her kindness and wisdom. The funeral cottage that carried Isabella's body to its final resting place at the Celestine Convent in Paris was one of the largest seen in medieval France. Representatives from across Europe came to pay their respects to a woman who had embodied the complex interactions between personal courage and political necessity that characterized her age. Charles of Orléans was devastated by his wife's death. He had lost not just a beloved spouse, but a trusted advisor and political partner whose insights had been crucial to his success. The grief-stricken widower would eventually remarry, but he never forgot Isabella or the happiness they had shared during their brief time together. Isabella's children grew up to play significant roles in French and European history. Her son Charles would become a noted poet and patron of the arts, while her daughters would make advantageous marriages that strengthened the Orleans family's position. All of them carried forward the values their mother had instilled in them: courage, compassion, and a commitment to using their privileges in service of others. The political consequences of Isabella's death were felt throughout France and beyond. Her absence removed a moderating influence from the Civil War, and the conflict between the Orlandan and Burgundian factions became even more bitter and destructive. The peace she had worked so hard to achieve remained elusive, and France would continue to suffer from internal divisions for years to come. Isabella's legacy, however, extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of her death. She had demonstrated that even in an age when women were expected to be passive political assets, it was possible for a determined individual to carve out a space for independent action and moral leadership. Her life story became a source of inspiration for other women facing similar challenges. The example of Isabella's courage and intelligence was cited by later generations of female rulers and political actors who sought to expand the boundaries of what was considered possible for women in public life. Modern historians have sometimes struggled to understand Isabella's story, caught between admiration for her personal achievements and discomfort with the circumstances that shaped her life. The marriage of a 6-year-old child to a 29-year-old man violates contemporary sensibilities about childhood and consent, even when we understand the political necessities that drove such arrangements. But to judge Isabella's world by modern standards is to miss the profound humanity of her story. She was born into a system that treated royal children as diplomatic assets, but she managed to transcend those limitations and create a life of genuine meaning and accomplishment. Her marriages, whatever their origins, became partnerships based on mutual respect and affection. The violence and political instability that marked her era were not products of moral failing, but of a world where personal security and political legitimacy were constantly contested. Isabella's ability to navigate these challenges while maintaining her integrity and compassion speaks to the enduring human capacity for growth and moral courage. Her story reminds us that history is not just about the grand movements of armies and the rise and fall of kingdoms, but about the individual human beings who lived through these events and shaped them through their choices. Isabella of Valois chose to be more than a victim of circumstances, and in doing so, she created a legacy that transcends the specific political arrangements of her time. Looking back across the centuries, we see in Isabella's life both the limitations and the possibilities that have always characterized human existence. She was constrained by the expectations of her age and gender, but she found ways to exercise agency and to make meaningful contributions to the world around her. Her story is ultimately one of resilience, intelligence, and the refusal to accept that personal happiness and political responsibility are mutually exclusive. The medieval world that produced Isabella of Valois was harsh and unforgiving in ways that we can barely imagine. Life was short, childhood was brief, and political alliances were often sealed with human lives. Yet within these constraints, people like Isabella found ways to create beauty, to show kindness, and to build relationships that brought meaning to their existence. Her legacy is not one of victimhood, but of triumph over circumstances that would have crushed a lesser spirit. In the end, Isabella's story is a reminder that every age has its own moral complexities, and that the people of the past, however different their world may seem, shared our fundamental human needs for love, security, and purpose. To understand her life is to understand something essential about the human condition, that we are all products of our time, yet capable of transcending the limitations that time imposes.